Hi, I'm Mary Beth Moylan, and I am the moderator and introducer for this second panel. And the second panel is going to concern unintended consequences of legalization. We have two very different presentations that we're going to do in this panel. One is the science, and we have Dr. Itai Danovitch here to talk to us about the facts and fallacies of the science on marijuana. And he's got a slideshow. The slides are also in your program booklet. I looked at the slides, and to be honest, I didn't understand most of it. But there's really a nice one that has like a seesaw and a little leaf on it, and I totally get that. So hang tight. And I think you'll understand it by the end. That's what I'm hoping. Fingers crossed. So Dr. Danovitch is the Director of Addiction Psychiatry Services at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He writes about and studies pharmacological and psychosocial interventions for addiction. So you might be able to talk to him afterwards. I'm going to talk to him a little bit about caffeine. And I hope he's going to have some insights on that too. So we're really lucky to have him. He'll talk to us about the science and separate out the facts and fiction. So thank you for being here, Dr. Danovitch. After he talks, we're going to have questions for him. And then next, Professor Mike Vitiello will come and talk to us about the initiative process, why it was the wrong way, but maybe the only way to go. And Professor Vitiello has been here at McGeorge since 1990. He teaches criminal law, civil procedure, lots of other classes. He's why we're all here today. He's the force behind this symposium, and I feel very lucky that he invited us all here to talk about this issue. He writes extensively in the area of criminal law, specifically 3 strikes, and recently he's been writing about this, about legalizing marijuana. Professor Weisberg mentioned his article in the Wisconsin Law Review. I encourage all of you to take a look at that. And today he's going to talk about the use of the initiative process for marijuana reform, including lessons from Proposition 215, which was the Compassionate Use Act. That's the Medical Marijuana Act, as well as the Proposition 19, which was on the ballot in November and failed. I'm going to do a real quick little pitch here for the fact that the California Initiative Review, which is an objective, neutral evaluation of all statewide ballot measures, and in November, we analyzed Proposition 19. 2 students, Katie Oldham, who was here but looks like she left, and Corey Hilton, did a really nice objective analysis of Proposition 19. We have copies of the Initiative Review out on the table. So if during lunch you want to grab one and take a look specifically at Proposition 19, but also if you want to have an objective, neutral evaluation of the other propositions that you voted on, you can check that out. Before every statewide election, we at Pacific McGeorge put out an online publication, the California Initiative Review. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, next election cycle, when you're confused, you don't know what those ballot measures are about, hit the McGeorge website, and you can get your neutral, objective evaluation. Okay, that's my plug, and now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Danovitch.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I hope to thoroughly confuse all of you. Actually, there are more slides than I will show you than are in your presentation, but not too many, hopefully. It's a total honor and privilege for me to be here with all of you, hopefully bringing a medical perspective to this policy analysis or discussion of marijuana. I think that it's particularly appropriate because marijuana sits at an intersection between public health and public policy. Historically and currently, estimation of marijuana's effects, which there needs to be some estimations of its effect to make appropriate policy about it, has really been influenced by ideology, by culture, by historical factors, in some cases religious factors. So my hope is to, again, lend a scientific or medical perspective to that as well to help you make decisions about it. I'm going to essentially first start by talking about some of the actions of marijuana. I will have a few, I promise you, just a very few kind of techie slides on the science of how marijuana does what it does to the brain, because I think it's an important framework for understanding what its effects are, both positive and negative. Then I'm going to address 3 myths, which are very common. Those myths are that marijuana is not really addictive. Marijuana has no legitimate medical benefits. And the third myth is that marijuana is totally harmless. And then finally talk about some implications and hopefully have time for some questions and discussion. Okay, so what is marijuana? I'm not going to belabor this because I'm sure you all know what it is. It comes from the cannabis sativa plant. And there are many, many, many preparations, distillations, concentrations of marijuana. You see here imaged a picture of hash oil, of some hashish, and also 2 different kinds of marijuana. These preparations differ in their potency and in the amount of the main psychoactive chemical in marijuana, THC, that causes intoxication. And these percentages that you see up there reflect the amount of THC. There's actually about 60 different cannabinoids in marijuana, and altogether about 420 chemicals. And this is why you can't just distill any one thing and call that marijuana. It's an herb. But THC is the main psychoactive ingredient. This is an image of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. That's what it looks like. How does it affect the brain? What does it do? It's very interesting, but THC actually mimics a brain chemical, a naturally occurring neurotransmitter called anandamide, which was discovered pretty recently, only in the 1990s, in the context of trying to understand what THC does. It was discovered by some Israeli researchers. And you can see that this chemical anandamide looks just like THC, right? And it mimics THC. And understanding and recognizing, discovering anandamide has opened up recognition that there's actually a vast neurotransmitter system in the brain. It's called the endogenous cannabinoid neurotransmitter system, right? The endocannabinoid system, which is involved in a lot of functions and has been preserved throughout evolution. It's in many, many different species, and so it's very important, and we're still understanding what it does. Okay, a couple of kind of techie slides. This is a picture of 2 neurons at a neuronal synapse. The synapse is the junction at which 2 neurons connect. And you have a presynaptic neuron, which is sending a message, to a postsynaptic neuron, which is receiving that message. Ordinarily, those messages go in one direction, right? The presynaptic sending neuron sends a neurotransmitter which communicates with the postsynaptic neuron. Essentially, in a nutshell, what the endocannabinoid system does is it's a mechanism for the receiving neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, to send feedback information back to the presynaptic neuron and to modulate the signal. It'd be kind of like your TV ordinarily gets a signal from the DVD player or Blu-ray player and just plays that. If your TV player was able to send back a message to attenuate the signal, to modify the intensity to get a perfect crisp image, that's kind of what it does. So the endocannabinoid system modulates a lot of other systems in the brain. Okay, where is this system found? This is a picture of a rat brain that's been stained with a pigment that attaches onto cannabinoid receptors. And essentially what you can see is that cannabinoid receptors are located diffusely throughout the entire brain. It's actually probably the broadest neurotransmitter system that there is within the brain. And it's especially located in areas of the brain that are responsible for mood, for memory, for motor coordination, for perception, especially things like sense of time, for attention and arousal. And you can actually correlate the areas of the brain where you find cannabinoid receptors to the experiences that marijuana users have of losing a sense of time, having interesting perceptions, changes in mood, sometimes increased anxiety and panic attacks, and people don't like it. Other times, euphoria, calmness, a sense of pleasure. Also, there's a lot of cannabinoid receptors in the parts of the brain that are responsible for executive function, the ability to organize and prioritize lots of information, to pay attention, psychomotor reaction time, the ability to quickly respond to stimuli. So there is an effect, for instance, between marijuana intoxication and driving. the difference between the intoxication effects of marijuana and some other substances is that typically marijuana users tend to be aware and try to compensate for those results, and so you don't get as drastic an increase in accidents as you do with other substances like alcohol, where people's judgment is impaired and they think, oh, I'm fine, and you get like a 15-fold increase in accidents. With marijuana, it's probably about 2 to 3-fold. So still an increase, especially when you think about marijuana use on a population level. There are also endocannabinoid receptors all throughout the rest of the body. They're on immune cells, on parts of the physiology that are involved in reproduction, on our physiological stress axis, on parts of the body that are important and the brain in experiencing pain or analgesia. And it's for this reason that pharmaceutical developers and innovators are very interested in the system to develop targeted compounds that affect these systems. Okay, so that's the background on what marijuana does, its intoxicating effects. And I'd like to now address these 3 myths about marijuana. Marijuana is not really addictive, marijuana has no medical benefits, and marijuana has no harms. Okay, so the first myth, marijuana is not physically addictive. Where does this come from? This is a very prevalent belief, perception about marijuana. A number of people asked me about this at the reception yesterday. And I've pulled this quote from Proposition 19 because 4.6 million Californians voted on it, and I know they all read the fine print of the finding section from the initiative, as they all do. It says cannabis is not physically addictive. So what's the evidence that marijuana is actually addictive? Is there any evidence? First, what is addiction? And is addiction to coffee the same thing? You know, is there such a thing as addiction to coffee? Only if it causes major problems in your life. If your cardiologist tells you it's going to give you a heart attack and you can't stop despite that, and you know your husband leaves you and your kids are left at school waiting for mom who's just at Starbucks getting more and more. Yeah, then come talk to me. I'll give you my card. So it's a maladaptive pattern of use that causes distress. So it has to cause distress. It has to be maladaptive. And it tends to be characterized by symptoms in the following domains: physical dependence, tolerance, and withdrawal. That's neither necessary nor sufficient for a diagnosis. Loss of control over use, compulsive use, and having harmful consequences from that use. Okay, there are 4 lines of evidence that we use to determine what kind of substance actually can cause addiction. And I'm going to go through that right now. You can apply this series of kind of analysis to cardiac drugs, to asthma drugs, to any kind of drug, including drugs you think may have abuse potential. One is the neurobiology of the drug. Marijuana has the cornerstone feature of all drugs of abuse, which is that it causes dopamine release in the pleasure center of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. It does that. Not all drugs do that. Not all therapeutic drugs do that. That doesn't make it bad or good. It just means it does that. Preclinical studies are essentially animal studies. You can look at animal models of addiction and check and see whether whether a drug is intrinsically reinforcing to an animal, whether the animal wants more of it. And yes, animals will self-administer marijuana to them if left to their own accord. They like it. A clinical diagnosis basically means establishing that an individual meets the criteria that I just reviewed to you that we use to characterize addiction. I've posted here a study of marijuana withdrawal, not because that's the only characteristic of addiction, but because it tends to be one of the things that we all associate with addictiveness of a substance. And historically, it was thought that marijuana didn't cause any addiction because the addiction isn't severe in the way that alcohol withdrawal is. Sorry, I said addiction. The marijuana withdrawal isn't severe in the way that alcohol withdrawal is. Alcohol withdrawal can kill you, and heroin withdrawal is a total misery. Marijuana withdrawal in severity is probably a lot more similar to nicotine withdrawal. So not totally severe, but it certainly sustains the habit. This is a study done by Alan Budney, who has done a lot of work in this area, and he measured symptoms of marijuana withdrawal, so irritability and aggression, restlessness, decreased appetite, difficulty sleeping. And what he did here is he looked at individuals who were heavy marijuana smokers and then were paid not to smoke for 5-day periods of time. And what you can see is during the times that they were smoking marijuana, that's the red or kind of burgundy line, they didn't have many of these symptoms. And then during the 5-day periods when they were paid to stop and tested to show that they were not smoking, all of these symptoms went up. And then they smoked again, the symptoms went down. So clinically in practice, I have patients coming to me all the time telling me, doctor, marijuana helps with my anxiety, it helps me sleep better, it improves my appetite. And a lot of them are telling me the absolute truth because marijuana is helping the withdrawal symptoms they have as soon as they stop using the marijuana. And then finally, there's epidemiological evidence. This graph from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime basically looks at annual prevalence rates of marijuana use across the world. And you can see it's particularly high in Northern America, but it's high throughout the world. And a couple things are important. One, in areas where marijuana is available, the rates of addiction are similar. It's about, I didn't mention this a moment ago, but it's about 1 out of every 10 or 11 users who use marijuana, so about 8 or 9%, go on to develop dependence on it. 91% of people that use marijuana don't develop addiction to it. It's a minority, but that minority is big given how prevalent marijuana use is. And this is a phenomenon that not just localized to California or to the United States. It's throughout the world. And people also independently seek treatment for marijuana. They ask for help. I think it's the second most common drug-related reasons that people present to ERs. Okay. Myth number 2, marijuana has no legitimate medical benefits. Okay, now this is from our own Bible, the FDA, Schedule 1. There's 3 main criteria for determining that a drug should be Schedule 1, that it has abuse potential, that it has no established safety profile, and that the drug has no currently accepted medical use in the United States. And that's what our FDA has said by scheduling marijuana as 1. This is false. I think that there is established evidence for efficacy of marijuana in a number of medical conditions, for a number of symptoms, the symptom of losing appetite, anorexia, for nausea and vomiting, wasting, which is loss of muscle, spasticity, particularly associated with MS. And there are some diseases or some conditions for which there have been high-quality, double-blinded, randomized controlled trials which have shown that marijuana has some benefits. Okay, and all of the key institutional bodies that set standards of care and guidelines in medicine have essentially expressed support for doing additional research into cannabis and to rescheduling marijuana down from Schedule 1. So they've expressed concern about using a smokable delivery system for any drug because it has problems and because there's 420 chemicals in the herb marijuana besides the active THC. But they've acknowledged that there's safety and efficacy in some conditions, as I just mentioned to you. They've called for additional research and for reevaluating the scheduling. Okay, next, marijuana is harmless, right? What's the big deal anyways? This is again from Proposition 19 from the findings section. It does not have any long-term toxic effects on the bodies. And when I see adolescents, and actually a lot of the parents of adolescents, they say, I have adolescents who have tons and tons of information from online which proves to them, convinces them that marijuana has no long-term effects at all or risks. And I've had a number of parents who've helped facilitate their parents getting marijuana cards because then at least they won't get in trouble if they do get caught and they won't have to deal with the consequences of entering the legal system. So this reflects a sense that the harms of marijuana, if they exist at all, are less than all the other potential harms that can come from using it in our current society. So does it have any harms? There are three sets of risks that I want to outline. First, the physical risks. The main impairments that are caused by marijuana are caused by marijuana intoxication, and I described them earlier. Right? Marijuana affects cognition in no uncertain terms. Even if marijuana were to not have any long-term consequences at all, going through all of high school and college stoned is not going to allow you to perform at your own best. You're going to be performing at a subpar level. Now, we all know people, I knew people in high school, in college, and medical school that sail through and that get A's despite smoking marijuana all the time. Those people are probably incredibly intelligent and are still functioning at their own B or C level. Now, if you take somebody whose intelligence is at a C level and then you have them stoned all the time, they tend to have school failure. So there are consequences, even though some people can apparently get by despite that. The bigger question has been, are there long-term consequences? You have a heavy smoker and they stop smoking. Is there residual effects? And when IQ has been studied in long-term smokers that have stopped, there haven't been any decrements that have been shown in IQ. Broad testings of intelligence have not shown that there's any kind of toxicity, this is your brain on drugs, kind of results from marijuana. What there have been is when you do more challenging tests of cognition, when you challenge somebody's ability to really kind of max out their ability to think, you see decrements relative to what you would expect from that person. So there are some signals that there are long-term effects for chronic heavy users. And the earlier there's heavy exposure to marijuana, especially in adolescence, the higher likelihood that there are some of these impairments that exist. The other big cognitive risk has to do with the reaction time, and I've talked about driving a little bit and the increase in accidents. With regards to the other physiological systems that are affected by marijuana, pulmonary, cancer, cardiac, the reproductive system, these are all areas where there's concern. You're inhaling smoke. How could that be a good thing? There is some bronchitis. There's irritation of the bronchial passageways. So far, despite the expectation that smoking marijuana is going to be associated with cancer, when you separate out tobacco smoking in studies, it's been very hard. Actually, nobody has really shown any definitive relationship between marijuana and increasing cancer. There's a lot of face validity to the concern, but there isn't yet evidence to point in a clear way to that relationship. Marijuana is a mild stimulant, mild cardiac stimulant in people that are at risk of having a myocardial infarction because they just had one and they're just out. Marijuana is not a good idea. It can increase the rate of them having another MI, but this is not a relevant risk in people that don't have that risk factor. Animal studies have shown that there are cannabinoid receptors throughout the reproductive system. Again, we don't have great evidence in humans that there's actual impairment, maybe some mild impairments in growth. But animal studies do show that there are some problems, and this remains a risk, so that we do consider pregnant or nursing women to be an at-risk population with regards to the potential risks of smoking. What are the psychological risks of, it's a little bit artificial to separate biological from psychological risks because they're one and the same, but I talked about the risks of addiction. They develop in about 1 out of every 10 or 11 smokers. The risk between marijuana and psychosis, this is an association that has long been detected, and the question has been, what comes first? What's the chicken and what's the egg? Is it that people that have a risk of developing schizophrenia or psychosis just go on to smoke more marijuana? Are they self-medicating with marijuana? Or is that an independent risk factor that can causally contribute to the development of that psychotic disorder? This has been studied pretty extensively, and this is a meta-analysis from Lancet that was done of 7 high-powered, huge population studies which attempted to control explicitly for confounds and for things like reverse causation, the notion that people with pre-existing psychotic disorders might be smoking more. And they found a significant risk, an increase. You could see this is odds ratios. The black line basically, the black boxes basically demonstrate the increase in risk that somebody has had if they ever smoked. The top graph shows ever smoking, and the bottom one separates out high smokers. And they found that the increase in risk of developing a psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia was 1.4-fold to 2-fold. They estimated that about 14% of outcomes in schizophrenia could be avoided if nobody ever smoked at all. And this is pretty significant. What about mood and anxiety disorders? That's also been a concern. There is less evidence pointing to a causal relationship there. There's definitely the withdrawal phenomenon I mentioned to you before. This top graph is also from a meta-analysis which looks at mood disorders, the relationship between smoking marijuana and depressive disorder, and the one below focuses on anxiety disorders. Again, you can see there is a relationship because of the black boxes, but if you notice the horizontal lines, those are confidence intervals. They're a lot broader, which shows that our signal there is much more diffuse, and we don't have as clear-cut a relationship as we do for psychotic disorders. I think it's safe to say, with regards to psychotic disorders, that if an individual has a family history of schizophrenia, has any pre-existing vulnerability, they are playing with fire to smoke marijuana because they're increasing their risk of having a lifelong, devastating neurological disorder. Okay, what about the social risks? This is actually a graph pulled from Kandel's 1975 landmark Gateway study, where he studied a cohort of New York City high school students and characterized their drug use patterns and characterized the fact that there seemed to be a linear progression between use of one substance and another, and marijuana occupied a critical juncture in moving from soft drugs and from alcohol, if you can call that a soft drug, to other illicit drugs, to hard drugs. And he developed this concept of the gateway theory. There's a lot of controversy about it because there's a lot of evidence that the relationship actually goes in both ways and that there's not necessarily a causal thing. Right? What's the mechanism through which marijuana actually increases the use of other illicit drugs and dependence on them? In fact, it's probably more a chicken and an egg phenomenon in the sense that adolescents who are socially disadvantaged and have conduct problems are more likely to use large amounts of cannabis or become early cannabis use. And early cannabis use is going to predispose you or exacerbate underlying impairments and contribute to living a lifestyle which is going to cause more problems. So question mark on the gateway effect, where there have been really clear signals is with regards to the effect of early smoking of cannabis and education. There's decreased educational attainment. There's more school failure. There's lower occupation among people that begin smoking marijuana or smoke heavy amounts of marijuana, and there are less ultimate income gains that people who are marijuana smokers can achieve. School failure in and of itself predisposes you to a whole host of lifelong adversities, unplanned pregnancies, greater criminal activity, et cetera, et cetera. And so anything that increases the risk of school failure has many, many downstream consequences that are significant. So youth are a particular at-risk population with regards to early cannabis smoking. So how do addiction specialists weigh all of these facts and all this information? There are some positive effects of marijuana. There's some negative effects of marijuana. I did a survey of California addiction specialists and surveying their beliefs, practices, and attitudes with regards to marijuana, and found a few things that by and large, with regards to prohibition, there's a sense, first, that marijuana intoxication does not cause crime or violence. Secondly, that prohibition sustains crime. This is a perception. And that incarceration is not effective. So not a lot of support for a prohibition-based approach to treat addiction, but these are addiction treatment providers. With regards to legalization, there's concern that there will be increased use. We probably wouldn't be here talking about it if there was no question of increasing use with legalization. That there are health effects that are significant, and that a smokable delivery system for anything can create some problems, and that there will be an increase of addiction. There's a lot of support for decriminalization among the addiction community and very equivocal support for legalization. Okay, so putting all together, what are the implications? This is the final slide. The implications were in the setting of legalization, how would we deal with potential, how could we anticipate consequences and deal with them ahead of time? One is that we would have to have some kind of plan for dealing with restriction of marijuana to at-risk populations, particularly youth, also pregnant women, also the mentally ill, particularly people with risk for psychotic disorders. Next, with regards to treatment, any measure that potentially increases addiction should really set forth provisions for its prevention and treatment. Currently, among adolescents in California that have a need for addiction treatment, only 1 out of 10 actually get it. So we have a huge problem here. If we're going to increase the amount of addiction, we need to be thinking about ways to deal with that. We can't do that without revenue, and we know that a lot of the interest in increasing in legalizing marijuana is to capture the revenue that's expected to be associated with it. Taxes should be commensurate to the social cost of the policy, and in a rational world should be applied to dealing with some of the fallout of it. I emphasize rational. With regards to labeling, it took decades and decades to get appropriate labeling on cigarettes. We know that brand preferences for beers are established in little kids by age 6. It's really important to have appropriate both restrictions on marketing, but also labeling on quality, on quantity, on percent, on what exactly is in this herb. There needs to be oversight of all the various aspects of the industry. I'm not going to get into all the details on them. There needs to be some kind of standardized way of determining what is impairment, because blood levels of the active of THC are sustained in people that smoke regularly. And we don't have a way of determining in any kind of standardized way if you pull somebody over on the road because you believe they are intoxicated with marijuana and proving that, or an employee and somebody who is in a sensitive occupational position, a surgeon. Finally, this is a grand social experiment that we're all considering, because I don't believe there are any examples of any other industrialized country or any country, period, that has frankly legalized any substance or marijuana. I guess that some substances have been legalized. But we need to have a plan to be able to research and understand and document the impact of the policy. We all have ideas about what has happened with the medicalization of marijuana and medical marijuana in California, but there's very inadequate data to support making sort of causal determinations about what the impact has been. With that, I will wrap this up, and I look forward to hearing any questions you may have.
Well, symposium editor and I, Katie Nystrom, the symposium editor, and I started talking about this symposium many months ago. And I was really delighted when she agreed that we were not just going to line up the usual suspects, the avid proponents and the avid opponents of legalization. And one reason why was that debate's been had. It's been had so many times, it's become a stale debate. And as you can see from the speakers already, this is a very sophisticated and difficult question. And my hope is that symposia like this can start to change the debate, and that we can really have a much more important debate as we move forward from here. Well, let me get into my remarks by explaining that when I was doing my article that Professor Weisberg referred to, I concluded at the end that I am a tepid legalizer. On balance, looking at all of the evidence, that I would urge legalization. But I think this is an extremely close question. And when I had the opportunity to vote for legalization of marijuana with Prop 19, I ended up abstaining. Now, what I want to do today is to make 3 points that explain why I took that position, why I ended up abstaining. My first point is, in effect, I can capture with a question. So what's wrong with the initiative process? And here I specifically look at Proposition 215 that gave us medical marijuana as kind of a case study on how not to legislate. The second point is that given the fact that people like me didn't vote for Prop 19 and it went down to defeat, is it still worth talking about legalizing marijuana? And until recently, I thought that legalization, if it came about, would probably come about through the proposition system. I've changed my thinking about that, and I think that there is a chance that it could come about through legalization. That takes me to my third point, which is probably my most important point, and is a point without any happy ending. I'm really just going to raise a bunch of questions, or at least some questions, as many as I have time for, that will focus on the kind of policy wonky questions that we ought to be asking instead of having this heated debate about legalization. I think there are a series of technical questions that really become the most important ones if marijuana is going to be legalized. So what's wrong with the initiative process? Proposition 215 is a classic example about how not to legislate. It came about, though, because Governor Wilson, then Governor Wilson, vetoed AB 1529, which was a very narrow medical marijuana piece of legislation that would have allowed medical marijuana use for 4 distinct conditions that actually had objective criteria for their diagnosis: AIDS, glaucoma, cancer, and multiple sclerosis. What happened, his veto emboldened the legalizers, and they got together and drafted what I call a Trojan horse, and that is Prop 215. Most importantly, the piece of language, there are a number of drafting flaws, but to get right to the heart of the matter, the initiative included this language, that a physician could recommend marijuana for someone with any other illness for which marijuana provides relief. Many of us were quite suspicious about the intent of the drafters of Prop 215 in including that language. We thought, for example, that it really was a way in which to get de facto legalization of marijuana. I had a remarkable conversation with Dennis Perrone, one of the drafters of Prop 215, and an avid marijuana proponent of legalization. My research assistants at the time decided that they were going to go over and talk to, I was doing the article I did many years ago on Prop 215, and my research assistants decided that they were going to go and interview Perrone. I didn't have the heart to tell them that legal scholars don't interview real people, and I certainly wasn't going to let my research assistants go off to San Francisco and have the word get out that they were hanging out in a pot club. So I went with them to make sure they did not misbehave, which they did not. I took them up to the wine country afterwards to show them how one really behaves. Now, what was amazing about the interview with Dennis Perrone was he was quite candid. He said, of course we were trying to get de facto legalization through this broad language. Now, that begs another question. Do we have de facto legalization? And the answer is sort of yes, sort of no. No, because, well, at least until the recent legislation that reduces marijuana possession to an infraction, in recent years we've had about 60,000 misdemeanor marijuana prosecutions a year. Now, that's a fairly significant number. But do we have de facto legalization? I find lots of data, helpful data, in the Sacramento News and Review. A couple of years ago, you could get a doctor's recommendation. It would cost you about $300. When I started lecturing, I got invited to give a marijuana lecture several months ago, and I checked Sacramento News, and the price of a visit to the doctor who was going to give you a recommendation had plummeted to $139. Ladies and gentlemen, for $50, you can now get a visit to the doctor. And I'm assuming you're going to come out of there with a doctor's recommendation. Why? Go back to that general language in the initiative, or any other illness. Anybody not experience stress? Qualifying condition, almost certainly. Again, so we have a de facto legalization, I think. Well, you might ask, Vitiello, you believe you're a tepid legalizer, so what's wrong with the fact that we got legalization through the initiative process, through Prop 215? What are you complaining about? Well, several things. We've had about 15 years of chaos, and we've had years of litigation, We've had the legislature have to come in and try to patch up the bad legislation, the bad initiative. We've had aggressive state law enforcement at times trying to undo the initiative. The uncertainty has had a human cost. A number of people have ended up being prosecuted, and some ended up in prison, even though they were acting in good faith, believing that they came within the law. Some of them lost property through forfeiture. And then it's been quite economically wasteful, this start and stop approach that we've had under Prop 215. Take a look, for example, at what's happened in Los Angeles. Los Angeles first, really after the Obama administration had sort of eased the stance on dispensaries, and then then Attorney General Brown came up with some guidelines to try to regulate the business. Any number of businesses opened up in Los Angeles, and then suddenly zoning laws have cut down on them. So you've had all this economic activity, small entrepreneurial business owners who then have had their investment undercut as we've bumped along on the uncertain road of Prop 215. Call me a Boy Scout. I also think one of the problems with Prop 215 is that the law lacks legitimacy, that the voters really didn't know what they were voting for because of this general language. The campaign to get Prop 215 enacted surely did not emphasize the fact that we had this open-ended invitation to get marijuana through that process. Instead, it emphasized the really seriously ill patients and the like. And then one other real problem that I want to highlight right now with the initiative process is that it's hard to undo bad legislation. In 2004, the California legislature tried to solve one of the problems that has really beset law enforcement and qualified patients, is are there any limits on the amount of marijuana that a qualified patient can possess? Legislature set some limits. The state Supreme Court struck it down because it was inconsistent with the initiative. And of course, there's a state constitutional provision that prevents the legislature, sensibly, the constitutional provision prevents the legislature from undoing the people's will simply by legislating it away. But the point is, the initiative process ends up locking us into bad legislation, making it much more difficult to correct the flaws of the law. Well, with the defeat of Proposition 19, is it still worth talking about legalizing marijuana? Is it a dead letter? And I think the answer is no, it's not a dead letter, and I think it's worth having the discussion. Proponents of Prop 19 learned their lessons from it, and I think that the next time around they'll do a better job in the way in which they approach the initiative process. And I think legislation is going to continue to be put in the hopper. Can it come about through legislation rather than through the initiative process? And here, until recently, I really did not think that it could come about through the legislative process. I've changed my mind. In fact, my original title suggested that the only way it would come about was through the initiative process, legalization, that is. I've changed my mind now. And so let me tell you why my thinking has changed, why I think it's possible that we would get legalization through a legislative process. Lots of Americans use marijuana. Good estimates are always hard to come by. Large percentages, very high percentages, favor medical use, medical marijuana legislation. Very high percentages favor reducing the seriousness of drug offenses generally rather than making them felonies. So you start to see a softening attitude since the war on drugs. And the case for legalization gets much stronger when you start to do demographics. That is, young people are much more likely to support legalization. No surprise. My colleague Julie Davies referred to the movie Reefer Madness, although it was produced in the 1930s. By the time I saw it in the 1960s, it had become a camp movie. It is so over the top. But that was the message that we got as young people about drugs. The message of, well, what happens is a young kid smokes marijuana and he ends up committing a murder. Doctor, I doubt there are too many cases like that, the quick correlation between one marijuana experience and going out and committing murder. Well, that was the thesis of Reefer Madness. Well, I asked my son, I said, he's 28 years old. I said, well, what are the kind of movies that you were raised on? The Big Lebowski. Hey, dude, don't we all love The Big Lebowski? Then he mentioned some others. He said, you got Pineapple Express, Dude, Where's My Car, and Road Trip. And I then thought back to one of my favorite movies, probably the best sports movie ever made, Bull Durham, and the great love scene at the end, smoke marijuana, Susan Sarandon and Kevin Costner. Some real passion generated in the bathtub. But you think about the favorable image of marijuana that we see in the media, and also think about this. Who are young people listening to? An uptight DEA agent, or Snoop Dogg, Woody Harrelson. I guess they don't really listen. Do you know who Willie Nelson is? Who else did I have? What other cultural icon? Oh, Jack Black. Some of the cultural icons who favor legalization of marijuana. So among young people, there is growing support for legalization, and it's not surprising. The other thing I want to point out for why I think legalization, again, one of the factors that makes it more probable, is that the marijuana proponents are winning the war of rhetoric. And here I'm not talking about truth, but they're winning the war of rhetoric, as you mentioned earlier. But here are some of the things that I would urge you to do if you have any doubts about that. Go on Amazon and do a search for books on marijuana. Almost all of them support legalization. Normal, for 40 years, has been a full-time lobbying organization for the legalization of marijuana. It's not alone. Do a Google search, marijuana, legalization, and the like. You'll come to a host of websites. Almost all the websites favor marijuana legalization. An enormous amount of technical information, too, about how to grow it and the like. Now, and when you go to the website, again, there's some fascinating data. And again, we're just talking about the rhetorical war rather than the truth of it. Think about these data reported on one website. Total deaths from drugs in the United States, 400,000 tobacco, 100,000 alcohol, illegal drugs, 10,000, caffeine, 2,000, aspirin, 500, marijuana, 0. That's powerful stuff, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the kind of rhetoric that I think is winning the war, in a sense, for hearts and minds, if you will. Further, proponents of legalization can point to the experiences in both the Netherlands and more recently in Portugal. In the Netherlands, in effect, that there has been a position largely of benign attitude towards marijuana use. At least the reports that you see publicized suggest that there's been no increase among teens. The Cato Institute has just recently published a very positive study about the effects of basically medicalizing drug use rather than criminalizing drug use in Portugal. Again, proponents have these kinds of data to point to. I don't think alone those kinds of arguments that have been around for a while would produce legalization, but you all know about the economy. And let's talk about the size of the marijuana trade. Getting good estimates about how big it is difficult. Somewhere between $4 and $14 billion in California. That's a very big crop, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe $40 billion nationwide. Compare that, for example, to the wine trade. One of my research assistants tells me that the Wine Institute reports that the wine trade is worth about $60 billion. That generates about $15 billion a year in taxes. Suddenly, it demonstrates a couple of things. One, the sheer size of the marijuana industry suggests that the war on drugs has failed and is expensive. The other thing, it's a piñata. Because in a day when we're worried about reducing taxes, here suddenly is this big source of potential tax revenue. And we know it's already putting money into the state coffers because of taxation of marijuana dispensaries. Well, Until recently, I think the Willie Horton syndrome probably prevented many politicians from coming out in favor of legalization because of the fear. In my world, there are two kinds of politicians. Those who are afraid of being called soft on crime, and those who have the brush to tar them with a claim. And those of you who are old enough to remember the 1988 election, the Willie Horton ad is considered one of the pivotal moments that really shifted the election to the first George Bush. There's actually a shift now among conservatives. For many reasons, conservatives, if they take seriously their philosophy about individual responsibility and the like, they tend to actually, intellectual conservatives tend to support legalization of drug use. On the other hand, obviously conservative politicians have not. You're starting to sense some change in that area. Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, and former attorney Ed Meese are all part of a group intentionally, the pun intended, Right on Crime. Right on Crime is now focusing on really the glut of the prison over incarceration problem. They don't focus specifically on the need to change drug laws, but if you go to their website, they point out that states that have shifted resources from incarceration to drug treatment have had success in maintaining public safety and reducing cost. So when I'm looking at that picture, I think that talking about legalization is not foolish, and that it's a possibility, certainly in our lifetime. So that takes me then to the kinds of questions that we really ought to be asking if marijuana is going to be legalized, the kind of policy wonky questions. Peter, don't go. I'm about to talk about you. Right? Keep an eye on that guy. Actually, it's right here in my notes. It says Peter, and the guy's walking out. Peter Hecht is writing some of the most interesting things on marijuana. If you want to find out what's going on in the marijuana trade, Google Peter Hecht and the Sacramento Bee. But I wanted him to hear this part of it because if we're going to legalize marijuana, I think many of us, like me, want to do it because here's this big untaxed industry. And certainly one of the reasons to do it is for taxation. Now, the story that Peter wrote and sent to me recently was about an IRS audit of one of the cannabis clubs over in the Bay Area. It's one of the biggest cannabis clubs in the world, or at least it so proclaims. And the IRS is invoking Reagan-era legislation, tax code that prevents drug dealers from deducting ordinary business expenses. Now, if the service is going to win that battle, there is a tax court opinion suggesting that cannabis clubs don't come within the law. But there's the problem is that if the service prevails, that it would drive cannabis clubs, medical dispensaries out of business. And the lesson I take from that is a large lesson, and that is any efforts for states to reform marijuana laws, if the goal is taxation, have to have the cooperation of the federal government, if not the forbearance. At a minimum, we need the forbearance. Is that possible? That's an interesting question. I'm not going to speculate about it now. I have some theories about whether that kind of collaboration is possible. But again, in thinking about legalization, we can't think about it without thinking about a collaboration with the federal government. The second thing I want to talk to you about, the second question that I think policy makers ought to think about actually goes to Prop 19. And again, back to my earlier point that I couldn't get myself to vote for it. One of the things that Prop 19 did was it created a personal exception. Well, we're going to be able to tax marijuana, said Prop 19. Individuals have the right to a home garden, a 25 square foot plot. I have a sneaking suspicion that Prop 19 proponents were not interested in the tax issue at all. I don't know this for a fact. I think they were interested in legalization without concern about taxation. And I find evidence of that in this 25 square foot plot. I tried to get a good estimate about how much marijuana you could grow on a 25 square foot plot, and an enormous amount of interesting data on the web. I found out a fascinating piece of data that 50% of the people in Humboldt County, somehow their living is through the marijuana trade. What I also found there, depending on how you grow your marijuana on your 25 square foot plot, that you might actually generate enough marijuana to produce close to a $200,000 profit. Now, Prop 19, you can make several crops a year. I think depending on the lighting you use, you can produce a crop in 57 days. Accurate, I don't know. But if that's the case, then do the math. Prop 19, if the goal was taxation, was going to undercut that by having an awful lot of marijuana off the taxing grid. Now, that begs another question. Again, if the goal is taxation, who is going to produce the marijuana? Who's going to grow marijuana? If the goal is taxation, that is a critically important question. At one extreme would be a government monopoly. You can see that, for example, if you qualify for compassionate use, a program that the federal government still, I think, has a couple of patients who get their marijuana from a field in Mississippi. If you have the government monopoly on growing it, well, that maximizes your chances of taxing it. I don't think anybody is seriously proposing that for various other reasons. If you have an open market at the other extreme, then the Attorney General, for example, from Mexico, suggested some of the problems that might arise there. If we have a completely open market, then the drug cartels are going to try to continue to move into that market. So these are the kinds of questions. How are we going to make sure that if we legalize it, in order to get tax revenues, how are we going to maximize that chance? Tommy Amiano, the assemblyman from the Bay Area, introduced a bill in the hopper a couple of years ago, and I think there's a new version in the hopper this year. One of the things they didn't think through was they were shifting the enforcement of marijuana laws to the tax code. So you'd be a tax code violator rather than a criminal. And I pointed out to the drafters of the bill that they were at odds, those two goals. If you want to reduce prison costs, you do it at the risk that you won't be able to raise any tax revenue. So you have to keep a criminal law enforcement threat in order to make sure you're going to get taxation, depending, again, on who you're going to allow to trade. Now, that raises one other possible supplier, and that is big tobacco. Now, there are a number of reasons why big tobacco would be the right group to do it. Big tobacco is used to complying with all sorts of regulations. They pay federal, state, and local taxes on cigarettes. They claim not to be interested in getting into the trade, but that may change as the perception changes. Well, that would probably reduce tax cheats. But if you want to see, the stereotypical marijuana smoker is that paranoid dude, go online and Google marijuana, big tobacco, conspiracy. That is what every marijuana producer in Humboldt County probably is waiting for, is the big federal government to come in and take over production of marijuana. Now, again, the taxation goal then becomes at odds with some other goals. One goal of legalization would be to try to bring in the large number of people who currently live in the gray zone of medical marijuana production and the illegal zone of illegal marijuana production. You want to bring them into the mainstream and allow them to become tax-paying citizens without the risk of prosecution. Bringing in big tobacco is not likely to do it. I can't imagine those Humboldt County folks becoming corporate shills, working 9 to 5 for the man. All right. One other temptation, and then I'm almost done, Mary Beth, so you will not have to bring out the hook. The other caution is, if taxation is the goal, we better regulate and make sure that the temptation not to advertise doesn't become too great. because that, again, is at odds with some of the concerns that the doctor raised about addiction and the like, and the additional cleanup cost and the social costs. Back to Bob Weisberg's comment, this is truly a house of cards. And I want to go back to my opening then. The debate between the partisans is over 40 years old. Many of you have probably had that argument late into the night over a joint or a bottle of beer. My guess is I could predict what side you are on by your substance of choice. Not much is new in that debate. But my hope now is that with conferences like this, that we can begin a new discussion. But that new discussion really becomes the subject that I think policy wonks, where their voice really counts. Thank you.